I am Dracula. I bid you welcome.
This Halloween, you won't like me when I'm angry.
The Bloodstone.
Papa.
I bid you welcome.
For me, October begins with the sounds of Swan Lake. It's been like that for as long as I can remember, literally. But the past several years I've tried to incorporate a sort of pre-game to my annual October horror-thon, usually films from the silent era. Every year I begin with Caligari, a film that we have already discussed in this channel several years ago. Although at the time I was still in film school and wasn't able to keep up with my plans that I had. Now, I can. And now I can finally discuss Nosferatu, which I had planned to do years ago. This feels more appropriate, however, given that the remake is coming out this Christmas. Interesting. It's a shame we won't have it for October, but that does give us time to return to the original. Nosferatu really is a fascinating beast. For one thing, the term Nosferatu is not a name. It technically means vampire.
Yes, Nosferatu.
Ah, it means not dead.
It's a common misconception, much like Frankenstein and his monster. I partially blame titling for the confusion. With Nosferatu, I blame SpongeBob 100%. Well, at least it helped bring some more mainstream attention to the character. As if to say there isn't someone on this planet who isn't familiar with the imagery of this film. And I don't mean that everybody's seen it, but everyone has seen something from this movie. It's undoubtedly some of the most historically significant imagery for cinema. Love it or hate it. The origin of the word Nosferatu is debated a bit. It came into popularity with Stoker's novel Dracula, which he himself got the word from Emily Gerard, a novelist whose collections of Transylvania folklore inspired Stoker and subsequently this film. It's said to be the Romanian term used for the creature known as a vampire, and to be associated with the vampirism epidemic. The term can be traced earlier than this, but much like the early iterations of the concept of the vampire, it gets weird and confusing. It may sound silly now, but back in the 18th century, people were more susceptible to myths of monsters and demons. Not that I can fully blame them with how scary living back then was in general. The belief of vampires led to real widespread panic in Europe, resulting in a lot of deaths and mass hysteria. The modern image of the vampire, the sexy, suit-wearing, womanizing, charismatic image of the vampire came about in 1819, the short story The Vampire by John William Peter Lorre, which was actually part of the famous Mary Shelley contest. It may not have left the same legacy as Frankenstein, but it's definitely set the groundwork for another story that would rival it. The story is definitely a gruff image of the modern vampire, but undoubtedly set the frame. I'd also like to acknowledge the 1872 novella Carmilla, which introduces many gothic motifs that we see to this day. Carmilla was a story about a young woman who becomes close to another woman, Carmilla, who happens to be a vampire. This also opens the juxtaposition of vampirism with homosexuality. With all of that said, 1897 finally saw the publication of Dracula. Now, for those who may not know it, Nosferatu was set to be an adaptation of Dracula. The film was produced by the short-lived German film studio Prana Film, known for making only one film, Nosferatu. The studio went into bankruptcy following all the controversy post the film's release. The studio was founded by Albin Grau, who was a real-life occultist. Albin wanted to use his studio to create mini films with heavy focus on the occult, but we can see how that worked out. Albin's desire to make a vampire-themed film came to him during the First World War. He met a Serbian farmer who had told him that his father was a vampire and brought the concept to Albin, so he said. They chose to make a vampire story based on Dracula, but here's the kicker. They never got the rights, so that puts Nosferatu up there with most famous ripoffs of all time. The screenplay was written by Henrik Galeen, who was a writer seasoned in dark romanticism, having worked with films such as The Golem or Student of Prague. Galeen changed the story to be set in Germany with German characters. Let us not forget the important film movement that this falls under, German Expressionism. Again, I discussed this in the Caligari video, but it's been a minute. It, of course, was one of the most famous movements of all cinema. It was a series of movements post-World War I that was meant to be a visual representation of emotions over reality, giving us some of the most iconic imagery, warped perspectives, jagged corners. It was really important for building the modern horror story. The film was shot all on one camera on one negative, and it was directed by F.W. Murnau. He is one of the most influential filmmakers of all time, ranging from films such as Last Laugh to Hollywood productions like Sunrise. Nosferatu is perhaps his most famous work. The film was released in 1922. This may surprise you, but there were actually criticisms on the film's release for it being too good. That is, critics complained the film was too perfect on a technical level for a horror film. This silly notion was scrubbed out as the film grew more popular and of course was praised for its visual style. It's needless to say, the film only became more popular and received more praise as the years went by. To this day, it's still regarded as one of the most influential masterpieces of cinema. Of course, issues arose with the film being a ripoff, and the Stoker family wasn't very happy about it. There was a major lawsuit in which the Stokers won, and because of this, every copy of Nosferatu was meant to be destroyed. But thankfully, copies still exist. The basic plot follows much of the novel. Hutter, who is the Harker role, is sent to Transylvania to meet Count Orlok, Dracula. He wishes to move to Germany, in the home across from Hutter. The novel starts on Hutter's journey, but here we actually start in Germany before Hutter leaves, meeting the Mina role, now Ellen. In this story, they are already married. Ellen is a bit of a combination of both Mina and Lucy from the original, while also feeling like her own character. She immediately opens up some of the gothic thought. Her husband brings her flowers, and her response is, "Why did you kill them?" What a jolly guy this Hutter is. He seems to contrast his rather gothic wife. And here we have Hutter's boss, Nock, who looks over his contract for Orlok. Well, you might think he's trying to summon Cthulhu. This is Albin's influence here, using Enochian, which is that even the proper way to say it? This was the occult language. I have no idea what this means, or how to translate it, if it even can be. Nock entices Hutter with the Orlok job, ensuring him that he'll make a lot of money. This is rather important to consider given that this was a post-war German film. Germany was in a period of hyperinflation now. Economic disaster ravaged the country, so hell, I'm sure a lot would have went to a vampire castle for some good cash. He tells Hutter to travel to the country of ghosts, and they both just laugh it off. I've never seen a man so happy to tell his wife, "I'm traveling to the country of thieves and ghosts." Hutter just has this really over-enthusiastic attitude. I suppose being the hero of the story in typical vintage film fashion, we want to see our chap here in good spirits as he embarks on this fantasy adventure. Hutter finally begins his travels, which brings us to the start of the novel. It goes without saying, as a lot of these early films, that the on-location shooting is so damn important for historical preservation. The fact that we can look at all these sites in motion from over 100 years ago, it's just unbelievably incredible. There are some beautiful landscape shots here. Now those familiar with German expressionist films may be surprised to see how much natural life is shown here. Given when we think of expressionist, we think of exaggerated but beautifully crafted sets. It was an economic choice by Murnau to use more location shooting, which must have been greatly fascinating to audiences at the time, for a lot of them that never got to see this part of the world. There was no Google Maps or other means of showing these exotic locations unless you were rich enough to travel or maybe saw a picture in a book. The use of the natural world, I believe, still works on the expressionist level. It makes a fascinating balance with the dark fantasy of the story and gives us a convincing feeling that vampires are real. And well, some of those behind this movie probably believed it too. This sequence plays pretty damn close to the book. We have the old frightened townsfolk, creepy ambiguity playing up, and the dog, or hyena, werewolf. During his stay, Hutter finds a book that describes the vampire. In it, it states that the vampire must rest with soil from the Black Death. This, of course, is referring to the bubonic plague. This was a pretty smart move given that the world was still scorned after the events of the wrongly named Spanish flu epidemic. Again, they're throwing in more real-world horrors into this film. They don't mention the Spanish flu, but that doesn't stop the viewer at the time from getting a shudder down their spine. Hutter first encounters Orlok disguised as a carriage driver, and this cracks me up every time I see it. The footage is obviously sped up to give an impression of traveling at a fast pace, but damn, they zoom in. Well, at least now Hutter stopped grinning like an idiot. Hutter's time at Orlok's castle is a heavily condensed version of Harker's. It, however, feels far more nightmarish. Orlok is played by Max Schreck, who is just a creepy son of a bitch. Watching this film in HD does take away some of the fun of his visual appearance. The closer we are, the more imperfections we can see in the makeup. God, I'm sounding like those idiot critics. Regardless, his eeriness comes in his movements or postures. Even something as simple as reading a document, picking up an item, or just sitting, standing. He's just constantly something you don't want to be around, which of course is a major contrast to Dracula. Even when he was old and creepy, he was still charismatic and had some human-like qualities to him. Harker and Dracula conversated well for many long nights together. Here, Hutter, much like us, doesn't really want to be around this guy for long periods of time. Orlok reminds us how vampirism is a curse. Dracula might seem like a badass pimp. Orlok is a damaged, animalistic creature. We feel sympathy for him at times, as if we're watching someone who used to be human, trapped in a hellish existence. This movie makes Orlok's backstory different from Dracula's. Orlok was someone who meddled with black magic during his time as a human, and was made into a vampire by Bailey, a demon of Satan. Orlok is just a more horrific Dracula. He also seems to be devoid of any brides or any residents of the castle, so he's an even more lonesome guy. Things turn more traditional expressionist when Ellen starts having some Caligari moments here. Ellen seems to have a strange psychic connection with Orlok, as her sleepwalking and nightmares are connected to Hutter's imprisonment. She even saves him by calling out, although the two characters are hundreds of miles apart. Orlok turns around, masterfully cross-cutting with Ellen to appear as if he were looking at her. This was a really innovative idea, an early montage technique that is common today, but pretty damn new here. Hutter confirms his suspicions by finding Orlok sleeping in his coffin. Here we have the first of one of the most iconic images or tropes of horror, and here it looks the most real. Pretty fascinating use of stop motion to give the impression of the coffin lid moving on its own and the horses running off. I can't imagine how hellish that was to shoot. It's rather horrifying to see just how Hutter suffers. He was such a happy, optimistic guy at the beginning, now he's become so worn and terrified. Something about this is just more disturbing to see just how beaten down a good person could be, and then he knocks himself out. As Orlok boards the ship to travel to Germany, we see one of the coffins is full of rats, some major foreshadowing we can all consider the major historical epidemics caused by these sons of bitches. During his travels, we move back to Germany, and we get introduced to some other characters. The most important is the Van Helsing counterpart. We also see that Nock is actually the Renfield character. The film gives us that impression earlier, although it's a nice change here. After reading all those occult symbols, Nock is turned into the crazy Renfield and a minion for Orlok. Hutter was completely oblivious to it, probably because he had money and adventure on the mind. Either way, someone else caught him and he got locked up in the asylum. That's all fun and whatnot, but now it's time to talk about the most important part of the film. Well, not really, but it's the part that everybody remembers. This would be the Demeter section. I think Ellen sitting on this lone bench here is my favorite composition of this entire project. The sea moving in the back, the crosses sticking out of the sand, just seeing this without any context is both beautiful and frightening. It intercuts Ellen's anxiety with the horrors happening aboard the Demeter. Lots of Dracula stories tend to greatly condense or skip this part of the story, and I always found it one of the most interesting parts of the novel. There's not a lot given to us, which allows for our imagination to run rampant on the hell experienced by the crewmen on the ship. Nosferatu actually spends a decent amount of time here, including giving us most of the iconic imagery of the film. When you see screenshots or stills from this movie, it's typically from this section. Whereas Hutter's time in the castle was a slow build-up, now we're just seeing what a monster Orlok is. Look at this dope transition effect to give him this sense of invincibility. Orlok kills the crew and the captain, bringing his vampiric plague to Germany. A reminder, sunlight is dangerous to vampires, so you may be asking, how the hell is he outside right now? Well, that's because these scenes were supposed to be at nighttime, but filming in the daylight was a lot easier for being able to see anything. Another major change here is that Dracula wanted to create an army of the undead, whereas Orlok just wants to feed and kill everyone. His murders are blamed to be a plague caused by the rats. Again, this film is changing or modernizing the goals of the monster to a more present fear. And truthfully, I do find it a scarier goal than Drac's army. Although the army probably makes more sense, a killing spree doesn't, and that in turn makes it scarier. It's nothing but bloodlust, an unapologetic mass murder that the citizens aren't equipped for. The arrival of the Demeter is quite thrilling. There's something very haunting on the empty ship that just so happens to find itself neatly to port. We have Nock here building up his excitement knowing that his master is soon to arrive. Nock knocks out a guard, and somehow escapes while Orlok just strolls out of the town holding his coffin. Orlok's presence brings an immediate wave of death to the town. Since the town suspects that it was the rats who brought the plague, they go into lockdown, leaving Orlok many houses to pick and choose from. Thankfully, our Van Helsing is on the case, leaving some religious symbolism to offer protection for the houses. Ellen reads Hutter's book about vampires and begins to piece together the whole situation. She learns that a woman without sin can distract the vampire by offering herself to him, leaving him vulnerable to the break of dawn. This shot of Orlok looking through the window from across the street is genuinely freaky. This shot doesn't bring your attention to it. It doesn't over-exaggerate. It wants you to naturally find it. Why Hutter hasn't gone across the street and smited the vampire in his sleep, I couldn't tell ya. Probably scared after all the ordeals. Yeah, that's it. The film becomes quite dreary here, dyed in blue to give a somber and nocturnal feeling to the imagery. We feel locked up, encased, as if we're forced to watch the number of corpses rise, but are powerless to do anything about it. The police want to use a scapegoat, and who better to use for bait than the person who no one likes? Nock. How the hell did he get up there? This is an early instance of the angry mob trope, but not the first. Back to Ellen. She decides to martyr herself to kill the monster once and for all. She opens her window, letting the horny bastard in. He doesn't fly in or anything, he just walks over. There it is! There's the shot! Here is the first vampire to be killed by sunrise. In the novel, Dracula is stabbed to death. This movie actually introduces the trope of sunlight being able to kill the monster. which we see in many, many Dracula films.
There. You're starting to look like your old self again.
Ellen has a few moments of life left to spend with her husband before dying. Nosferatu may be old, very, very old, but it still remains as one of the most terrifying films on screen. It doesn't scare us when we watch it, not like the modern-day roller coaster of jump scares devoid of aesthetic tension or fear like present-day horror films. This movie lurks, like Orlok. It's a constant reminder of the things that we fear: plague, famine, sin, death, and if you want to dig into the sexual implications, then VD for sure. Film works for many as escapism. Nosferatu isn't escapism. It forces you to remember the things we want to run away from, like being trapped in a nightmare we cannot escape. We are to watch the horror and be reminded of how scary life is. Orlok, being terror, is able to kill, and even more horrifying, manipulate the living into mass hysteria. I don't know what's more terrifying than a group of scared, angry human beings. And even when humanity prevails, the monster is killed, but there's little to no happiness to be found. Just a somber reminder. Thank you guys for watching this video. Be sure to check out some horror reviews we got coming out for October. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already, as it really helps my channel a lot. And as always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.